I suppose I always knew. Maybe not in a way I could put into words. Not as a kid anyway. But deep down, I always felt it, the imbalance. The weight pressing on me. The unspoken rule that my place in the family was secondary. Ethan was the star. The golden child. The one who made our parents beam with pride at every report card, every polished achievement. He could do no wrong. And even if he did, well, it was brushed off, excused, forgiven before the dust even settled. I, on the other hand, I was tolerated. A supporting character in the grand narrative of Ethan's success story. It was little things at first. The way my mother, Margaret, would light up when Ethan entered the room. The way my father, Robert, would brag about him to anyone who'd listen. My victories, small or large, were met with nods. Maybe a lukewarm "that's nice." But Ethan, he was celebrated. Family gatherings were the worst. Relatives swarmed him like he was some kind of celebrity, hanging on to his every word, asking about his plans, his goals, his future. Me, I got the polite, obligatory questions, then promptly faded into the background. If I ever voiced my frustration, I was met with dismissive laughs. "Oh, don't be dramatic, Danielle. You're just different." Different. That was their way of saying less. I tried. God, I tried so hard to be what they wanted. I worked just as hard, pushed just as much, but it never mattered. Ethan's excellence was effortless. Mine was exhausting, and no matter how much I achieved, it never changed anything. By the time we were adults, I'd stopped trying. I built my own life, started my own business. I was successful, even if my parents barely acknowledged it. Ethan, of course, followed the perfect script, became a lawyer, married Sophie, settled into a life that fit their expectations, and they adored him for it. I told myself I didn't care, that I had moved past it, that their approval didn't matter. I was wrong, because years later, when I had kids of my own, when I opened the door to let my parents into their lives, I learned just how deep the favoritism ran. And this time, it wasn't just me who got hurt. Would you like me to continue with part 2? Bananoy, part 2 with the applied changes. Chat GPT da noi. Part 2. A grandchild worth loving. One convinced myself that things would change when I had kids. That somehow, the moment my parents became grandparents, they'd see me differently. That they'd soften, let go of the old biases, and embrace my family as their own. I was a fool. When my first child was born, my parents were polite, distant, but polite. They came to visit, held the baby for a few minutes, made the appropriate cooing noises. My mother even took a few pictures, though she never shared them. My father nodded in approval, then shifted the conversation to Ethan, his career, his marriage, his life. Still, I kept trying. I wanted my kids to have grandparents, even if they weren't perfect. I invited them over, asked them to babysit, tried to include them, and each time they made excuses. "Oh, we're busy. Maybe next week." We don't really do well with little kids. Then Ethan and Sophie had their first child, and everything changed. Suddenly, my parents were the doting, ever-present grandparents they had never been for me. They threw a baby shower. They visited every day. They flooded social media with pictures, beaming captions about their perfect grandson. When Sophie had their second child, they practically moved into Ethan's house, helping with everything. Meanwhile, I asked them for a single night, just one night, to watch my kids, because my husband and I had an important business meeting. My mother scoffed. "We don't want to watch your children," she snapped. "We just want grandchildren from our wonderful son." It took me a second to process what she had said, and then she twisted the knife. "You are always worse than him, Danielle. Why should your kids be any different?" I couldn't breathe. My own mother looked me in the eye and told me, without hesitation, that my children weren't worth her love. I should have walked away then, should have slammed the door on them forever. But I didn't. Instead, I did something worse. I still held on to hope, and that hope would soon shatter into something much darker. I don't remember hanging up the phone. I don't remember grabbing my coat or walking out the door. All I remember is the cold rage pressing against my ribs as I drove to my parents' house, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I had spent my whole life being pushed aside, and for the most part, I had let it happen. But this, telling me my children weren't worth loving, that was a line they weren't allowed to cross. By the time I reached the house, I didn't even hesitate. My father, Robert, opened the door, looking surprised to see me, but I brushed past him and into the living room, where my mother, Margaret, was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. She barely glanced up. "Danielle, what are you doing here?" I ignored the question. "Why?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why do you treat Ethan's kids like royalty while mine don't even exist to you?" She sighed, setting her phone down with exaggerated patience. "Oh, for God's sake, Danielle, we've talked about this." "No, we haven't. You've just made excuses." My father stepped into the room, rubbing his temples like he already regretted getting involved. "You need to calm down," he muttered. "No, I need you to answer me," I shot back. Margaret exhaled. "Danielle, some people just shine more than others. Ethan has always been responsible, successful. Of course, we're closer to him and his family." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "Do you even know who's been paying for Ethan's life?" That got her attention, her brows knitted together. "What are you talking about?" I folded my arms. "Ethan is not a successful lawyer. He was laid off over a year ago. His wife, Sophie, isn't working either. Their perfect little life? It's drowning in debt. And you know who's been keeping them afloat? Me. For the past 15 months, I've been paying their rent, their kids' school fees, even some of their credit card bills." A heavy silence filled the room. My father turned pale. My mother just stared at me, confusion flashing in her eyes. "That's ridiculous," she scoffed. "Ethan would have told us." I shook my head. "No, he wouldn't, because he knows exactly how you'd react. And before you start making excuses for him, do you even know why he won't leave Sophie?" My mother frowned. "Leave her? Why would he?" "Because she's abusive," I cut in. "She controls him, humiliates him, and when he tries to push back, she makes sure he knows exactly who's in charge." "You think they're happy?" "Ethan calls me in the middle of the night sometimes, just to talk, just to have one conversation where he doesn't feel like a failure. But of course, you don't know that, because in your world, Ethan can't fail, right?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in my life, I saw her speechless. My father sat down, running a hand over his face. This can't be true," he muttered. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It is. You just never bothered to look past the version of Ethan you created in your head." Margaret finally found her voice. "We need to talk to him." I nodded. "And you need to ask yourselves if you're ready to be grandparents to all your grandchildren. Because I'm done chasing you." I turned to leave, but my father's voice stopped me. "Danielle, we're sorry. I didn't look back. We'll see." I thought that was the end of it, that I had said my piece, walked away, and that either they'd wake up or they wouldn't. I was wrong. The next morning, my phone started buzzing nonstop. First Ethan, then Sophie, then my mother. I ignored them all until a text from Ethan came through. "Get Mom and Dad out of my apartment now." My stomach dropped. I called immediately. Ethan picked up, whispering furiously, "What the hell did you say to them?" Before I could answer, I heard shouting in the background. My father's voice, loud and angry. Then Sophie's, shrill and defensive. "Are they fighting?" I asked. "Yes. Dad showed up this morning demanding answers, and now he and Sophie are about to kill each other in my living room." He took a shaky breath. "Get over here before someone calls the police." I grabbed my keys and left without another word. By the time I got there, the situation was already spiraling out of control. My father stood face to face with Sophie, his face red with rage. Sophie looked just as furious, but there was something else, uncertainty, like she wasn't used to being challenged. My mother stood off to the side, wringing her hands. Ethan looked exhausted, his arms crossed tightly, his eyes darting between the two of them like he was waiting for an explosion. I stepped inside and shut the door. "What the hell is going on?" My father pointed at Sophie. "This piece of garbage has been manipulating my son," Sophie scoffed. "Stay out of my marriage, old man." Robert took a step closer. "Or what?" For a second, I thought they were actually going to start throwing punches, but Sophie didn't move. That's when I realized she wasn't used to being confronted. She was used to controlling the situation, keeping Ethan under her thumb. But now, she wasn't sure what to do. I turned to Ethan. What did they say to you? He ran a hand through his hair. They came over this morning and said they needed to talk. Then Dad started pushing for answers, and Sophie got defensive. Things escalated from there. I looked at my mother. And you? She hesitated. I just wanted to understand why he didn't tell us. I let out a short laugh. Well, congratulations. Now, you know. Ethan let out a frustrated sigh. Danielle, the first told you not to say anything. Now, everything is worse. I met his eyes. No, it's not. Because for the first time, Sophie wasn't in control, and she knew it. Sophie's eyes darted around the room, her breathing sharp and uneven. She was still trying to act like she had the upper hand, but I could see the cracks forming. She's losing control. My father stood firm, his fists clenched at his sides, his entire presence radiating fury. My mother hovered near the couch, wringing her hands, her expression somewhere between guilt and realization. Ethan looked exhausted, like he was watching his entire world crumble and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. And Sophie was cornered. She tried to scoff, rolling her eyes like this was some kind of joke. Oh, please. You think you're going to waltz in here and save him? She turned to Ethan, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. Poor, weak Ethan. Always needs his big sister to fight his battles. That's cute. Ethan flinched. My father took a step forward, but I raised a hand to stop him. I wanted to handle this myself. You don't get it, do you? I said, tilting my head. This isn't about you anymore, Sophie. You're not in charge here. Her jaw tightened. I'm his wife. That makes this my business. I let out a dry laugh. A wife who treats her husband like an accessory, who isolates him from his family and makes him feel like he's nothing without you. I turned to Ethan. You think she loves you? Really? Sophie's head snapped back to Ethan, her eyes burning into him. Don't you dare listen to her. He hesitated, and that was all I needed to see. I sighed. She's been feeding you the same script for years, hasn't she? That you need her, that you'd be lost without her, that she's the only one who actually believes in you. I stepped closer, keeping my voice even. But tell me, Ethan, when was the last time you felt like an actual person in this marriage? Silence. My mother shifted uncomfortably. My father exhaled sharply. And Ethan looked at the floor. Sophie panicked. I saw it happen in real time. The moment she realized she was losing him. Ethan, she hissed, reaching for his arm. Don't be stupid. They're just trying to turn you against me. And that was it. The moment everything snapped. Because instead of shrinking back like he always did, Ethan pulled his arm away. No, he said, his voice quiet but firm. They're not. Sophie blinked. For a second, she looked stunned. Then her face twisted into something ugly. You ungrateful little. Enough. The voice that interrupted her wasn't mine. It wasn't Ethan's. It was my mother's. Margaret, the woman who had spent her entire life blindly defending Ethan, who had always painted him as perfect, who had refused to believe anything was wrong, had just spoken against Sophie. And she wasn't done. You're done manipulating him, she said, her voice shaking but determined. You don't get to keep him trapped in this miserable excuse for a marriage, just because you're afraid of losing control. Sophie let out a hollow laugh. Oh, give me a break. You're acting like I'm some kind of villain. My father stepped forward. You are. Sophie's mouth snapped shut. Ethan was still frozen, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing unsteady. My mother turned to him, her expression softening. Ethan, sweetheart, pack your things. You and the kids are coming with us. Sophie laughed again, but this time it was high-pitched, unhinged. You think I'm just going to let him walk out of here? And then, to my absolute shock, my mother looked her straight in the eye and said, yes. Ethan swallowed hard. I could see it, years of self-doubt, of fear, of conditioning all battling inside of him. Sophie saw it too. You leave me, and you'll regret it, she warned, her voice dark and low. That was the last straw. Ethan took a deep breath. Then he turned to me. Help me pack. For a moment, Sophie just stood there. Then she scoffed, shaking her head, muttering something under her breath, but she didn't stop him. Because she couldn't. She had lost. We moved quickly. Ethan grabbed a few bags, shoving clothes into them while I packed up the kids' things. My mother helped, which still felt surreal, while my father stood guard near the front door. Sophie hovered nearby, her arms crossed, glaring at us. I could feel the tension radiating off of her, but she didn't say another word, not until we were almost finished. That's when she stepped in front of Ethan. "You really think you're strong enough to do this?" she whispered. "You're nothing without me." Ethan met her gaze. "That's what you wanted me to believe." He stepped past her. "But you were wrong." She didn't try to stop him again. A few minutes later, we walked out of the apartment. Ethan, his kids, my parents, and me. Sophie slammed the door behind us. The drive back to my parents' house was silent. Ethan stared out the window, lost in thought, while my mother occasionally glanced at him, as if trying to process everything. My father was the first to speak. "We're getting you a lawyer," he said. Ethan blinked. "What?" "You're divorcing her," Margaret said, "and getting a restraining order. We're not letting her manipulate you anymore." Ethan hesitated. "You really think she'll let me go that easily?" My father's voice was cold. "She won't have a choice." I sat back in my seat, exhaling slowly. This wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time in years, Ethan had a real chance. And this time he wasn't fighting alone. I expected Sophie to fight back. I knew she wouldn't let Ethan walk away without making his life hell first. But even I underestimated just how low she would go. It started with messages at first. Long, desperate apologies, then guilt-tripping, then outright threats. "You think they'll save you? You'll come crawling back." Ethan ignored them. So she escalated. She called his workplace, spinning lies about him being unstable, hoping to ruin his chances of getting hired somewhere else. She sent messages to our parents, playing the victim, claiming we had brainwashed Ethan. And then, when none of that worked, she sent a text that made my stomach turn. Danielle should watch her back. I read it twice. Then I calmly put my phone down and drove straight to my parents' house. Ethan was sitting in the kitchen with my mother, drinking coffee. He looked exhausted, but better, stronger. I slid my phone across the table. "Sophie's trying to start something." Ethan picked it up, his face darkening as he read the message. "Ignore her," he muttered, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "I don't trust her not to do something reckless," I said. Before Ethan could respond, our father walked in. "What's going on?" I showed him the text. He read it slowly, then looked at me. "You want me to handle this?" That caught me off guard. "You?" He nodded. "Yes, me." I studied his face. He was serious. This was the same man who had spent our whole lives looking at Ethan like he was a golden trophy and me like an afterthought. And now he was standing up for me, without hesitation. I exhaled. "No," I said finally. "I got it." He nodded. "All right, but if she tries anything, call me." And for the first time in my life, I actually believed he meant it. I half expected Sophie to go quiet after that, but I should have known better. That night, as I was locking up my business, I noticed a car idling across the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then the driver's side door opened, and Sophie stepped out. I sighed. Of course. She walked toward me with that same smug confidence, hands in her pockets, like she was about to say something that would shake my world. "So, this is what you've been doing with all your money," she said, gesturing toward my shop. I didn't respond. I just crossed my arms and waited. She stepped closer. "You really think you won? That he's never coming back to me?" I tilted my head. "That's the point. He doesn't have to." Her jaw clenched. "You've been in my business since day one, meddling, making Ethan think he could live without me." I laughed. "He can live without you. And for the first time, he knows it." Her face twisted into something ugly. "I could ruin your life the way you ruined mine." That's when I felt it, the shift in the air. She wasn't just talking. She was trying something. She thought she could intimidate me, maybe even start a fight and spin it into a victim story. But I wasn't playing along. I stepped forward, closing the space between us. "Go ahead," I said quietly. "Try me." For a second, she actually considered it. Her hands twitched in her pockets, like she was debating whether to throw a punch. Then another voice spoke from behind me. "You got a problem, Sophie?" I turned. My father was standing near his car, arms crossed. Sophie's expression changed instantly. She took half a step back. "This doesn't concern you, old man." My father stepped closer. "It does if you threaten my daughter. My daughter, not Danielle, not your sister, but my daughter." That hit harder than anything Sophie could have said. She looked between the two of us, trying to decide if this was worth it. Then she scoffed, turned, and walked back to her car. As she drove off, my father exhaled. "Coward." I turned to him. "How did you know?" He shrugged. "Had a feeling. Thought I'd check in." I didn't say anything. I just nodded. For the first time in my life, my father had decided to show up for me. And damn, it felt good. After that night, Sophie backed off, at least physically. But she kept sending messages to Ethan, shifting between apologies and threats. Finally, I was done playing defense. I called my parents and told them to meet me at their house. When I arrived, Ethan was already in the living room, arms folded. My mother sat beside him, my father standing near the window. I placed my phone on the table. "We're ending this." My father nodded. "Agreed." To my surprise, it was my mother who spoke next. "We'll get you a lawyer." Ethan blinked. "A lawyer?" Margaret gave him a firm look. "A divorce lawyer. And a restraining order." Ethan hesitated. "You really think?" "Yes," my father cut in. "You need to be legally free of her. We'll take care of everything, but you need to be ready to fight if she resists." Ethan exhaled. Then he nodded. "Okay." That same day, we met with a lawyer my father knew. The man was ruthless. After hearing Ethan's story, he leaned back in his chair and smirked. "She's not going to fight this. Not if we do it right." And he was right. Sophie tried to push back at first. She sent more threats, more messages. But the second she got a formal notice from the lawyer, her tone changed. She knew if this went to court, she'd lose everything. A month later, the divorce was finalized. The restraining order was in place, and Ethan was free. Things didn't magically become perfect after that. My parents were still my parents, flawed, stubborn, sometimes frustrating. They still favored Ethan in small ways, but something had shifted. They invited me over more often. They actually asked about my life, my business. My father would call me just to check in. My mother sent gifts to my kids, bragged about them the way she used to brag about Ethan's. At first, I thought it was guilt, but over time, I realized it wasn't just that. For the first time, they saw me, not as the disappointment, not as Ethan's shadow, as their daughter. One night, I was sitting on the back porch with my father. We weren't saying much, just drinking, watching the stars. Then, out of nowhere, he said, "You did good, Danielle." The first turned to him, surprised. He nodded. "You saved them. Not us. You did." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded back. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to prove myself to him. He already knew, and that was enough. Story 2. I never thought I'd end up here sitting alone in this old house, surrounded by memories that feel more like ghosts. I'm 72 now, widowed just a week ago. My wife, Margaret, fought hard against cancer for 2 years, but in the end, it took her. And now, all that remains is this silence. Margaret and I were married for nearly 50 years. We built a life together in this house, filling it with love, laughter, and the little messes that make a home feel lived in. Our son, Daniel, was at the center of it all, our only child, the one we poured our hearts into. From the day he was born, we wanted the best for him. The best schools, the best opportunities. We sacrificed so he could have a future that was bigger than what we could have imagined for ourselves. And for a while, it seemed like it was all worth it. He was bright, ambitious, full of promise. Then he met her. Her name was Rachel. She came into his life like a storm, beautiful, unpredictable, and completely consuming. They met in college, fell in love fast, and married right after graduation. Margaret and I were happy for him, though we had our concerns. They were young, too young, we thought, to be making such a big commitment. We offered to let them live with us while they got settled, but they refused. "We want to do this on our own," Daniel had said, and so they did. At first, he called regularly, telling us about his new job, their tiny apartment, the life they were building together. But as time went on, the calls became less frequent. Weeks passed, then months, and suddenly it had been a year since we had last heard his voice. We called, no answer. We wrote letters, no response. It was like he had vanished, like we had never existed in his world to begin with. Margaret took it the hardest. She'd sit by the phone, checking it every few minutes, hoping for a message that never came. She'd bake his favorite cookies, as if somehow the scent of warm chocolate chip might bring him back, but nothing worked. We had no idea what we had done wrong. Had we been too overbearing? Too distant? We agonized over every choice we had made as parents, trying to pinpoint the moment we had lost him. But there were no answers, only the empty space he left behind. The years passed, and we learned to live without him. We traveled, spent time with friends, tried to focus on each other rather than the son who had forgotten us. But there was always that ache, that hole where he used to be. Then Margaret got sick. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd hear about it. Maybe he'd come rushing through the door, full of regret, ready to make amends. But he didn't. I took care of her myself, with the help of neighbors and friends. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, watching the love of my life slip away, knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it. And now she's gone. The funeral was small. Margaret wouldn't have wanted anything grand. Just close friends, family at least, those who still cared enough to show up. I stood at the front of the church, greeting people, barely holding myself together. And then I saw him, Daniel. He looked older, though I suppose I did too. There were touches of gray at his temples, lines around his eyes. Beside him stood Rachel, and two children, a boy and a girl, both clinging to their mother's hand. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, hesitantly, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me. The hug was stiff, awkward. It wasn't the embrace of a son who had missed his father, but rather of someone who wasn't sure if he was welcome. I let him hold on for a few seconds before pulling away. There was no time to talk before the service began. He and his family sat in the front row with me, and for the first time in years, I could hear him cry. When it was time for people to share memories of Margaret, Daniel stood up. His voice shook as he spoke. He talked about how she had taught him to ride a bike, how she always had a way of making everything feel okay, how she had been the best mother anyone could ask for. By the time he sat down, we were all in tears. After the funeral, as guests began to leave, Daniel approached me again. "Dad, can we talk?" We stepped into a quiet corner of the church, and then suddenly he broke down, his body shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry," he said, "for everything, for not being here, for missing so much time. I was young and stupid, and I thought I had to prove that I could make it on my own. Rachel kept telling me to call, but I was too ashamed. I didn't know how to fix things." I listened, my heart breaking all over again. But despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to be angry. He was my son, and I had missed him more than I could ever put into words, so I forgave him. We hugged again, and this time, it felt real. He introduced me to his children, my grandchildren, Michael, 8, and Lily, 6. They called me Grandpa without hesitation, as if I had always been a part of their lives. For the first time in years, my house was full of noise again. The kids ran through the hallways, their laughter echoing in spaces that had been silent for too long. Daniel and I sat in the living room, talking for hours. He told me about his life, the struggles, the triumphs, the moments he wished he had shared with us. I told him about Margaret's illness, about the life we had built in his absence. As the evening stretched on, I finally asked, "So, what's next?" Daniel hesitated. "We have a life in another state," he admitted. "A good life. The kids are in great schools, and Rachel loves her job. But I don't want to lose you again, Dad. Maybe you could move closer? We could see each other more often." The offer was tempting, but this house was filled with Margaret. It was where we had laughed, cried, built a life together. I couldn't leave it behind. I told him I would stay, that we could visit, call, make up for lost time in other ways. He nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. As they packed up to leave, Daniel hugged me tightly. "I love you, Dad," he whispered. And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. After they drove away, I sat in Margaret's favorite chair and let myself cry. I cried for the years we lost. I cried for Margaret, who never got to see this moment. I cried for the grandchildren I had just met, and for the son who had finally come home. And yet, beneath all the sorrow, there was something else. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was a new beginning. Little did I know, it was only the beginning of something much more complicated. For the first time in years, I felt like I had my son back. The house, which had felt so empty after Margaret passed, was filled with voices again. Every week, Daniel called me. At first, it was short conversations checking in, asking how I was holding up. But soon, the calls got longer. He'd tell me about work, about the kids, even little things like what they had for dinner that night. Then, a month after the funeral, he surprised me. "We're coming down for the weekend," he said one Friday morning. "Rachel and the kids want to see you." I was overjoyed. I spent the whole day getting the house ready, dusting off old photo albums, even baking cookies Margaret's recipe, the ones Daniel used to love. And when they arrived, it was nice. Better than I expected. Michael and Lily ran through the house like they'd lived there forever, touching everything, asking about every little knick-knack. Rachel was kind, warm, the kind of woman I had once resented for taking my son away. But now, I found myself grateful for her. She was the reason Daniel had come back. We spent the weekend looking through old pictures, reminiscing about the past. Daniel even got emotional when he found an old birthday card Margaret had written him, one he had never responded to. "I was an idiot," he murmured, shaking his head. I didn't disagree, but I told him what I had told myself 100 times since he came back. "You're here now? That's what matters." I wanted to believe that. Their visits became more frequent after that. Every other weekend they'd drive down, stay for a night or two. My house was full of life again. I'd wake up to the smell of coffee and the sound of cartoons playing too loud in the living room. I'd spend afternoons sitting outside with Rachel while the kids played, or tinkering around the house with Daniel. And for a while, it felt like I had a second chance. But then, little things started nagging at me. At first, it was subtle. Daniel would casually ask about my finances, nothing too direct, just small comments. "You managing okay with just your pension, Dad?" Or, "Ever thought about selling this place? It's a lot of house for one person." I chalked it up to concern. I was old, and the house was big. Maybe he was just looking out for me. But then he got more specific. "Do you still have the savings account you and Mom opened? Whatever happened to Mom's life insurance payout? Have you updated your will since she passed?" The first time he asked, I laughed it off. "You worried I'm not leaving you anything?" I joked. But he didn't laugh. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I tried to push the thoughts aside. After all, Daniel was my son. He had just come back into my life. I didn't want to ruin things by being paranoid. But then my sister, Linda, came to visit, and she noticed it too. Linda has always been blunt, never one to dance around a topic. So when she sat me down after dinner one evening and said, "I think Daniel's up to something," I wasn't surprised. "What do you mean?" I asked, playing dumb. She sighed, giving me a look. "Dad, I know you want to believe the best in him, but I've heard things. He's been asking around about your finances, your house, even your pension." I frowned. "Who told you that?" "Your neighbors. Some of your friends. Even Rachel pulled me aside last time and asked if you were doing okay financially." That surprised me. "Rachel?" Linda nodded. "I don't think she's in on it. I think she's genuinely worried. But Daniel, I don't know. Something doesn't feel right." I didn't want to believe it, but as soon as she said it out loud, all the little things I had ignored suddenly felt obvious. I spent the next few days thinking about it. Was I being paranoid? Was Daniel really just concerned, or was there something more to it? I decided I needed to find out. The next time Daniel and his family visited, I had a plan. After dinner, once the kids were settled in the living room, I casually brought it up. "I've been thinking about selling the house," I said. "It's too big for me, and honestly, I could use a change." I watched his face carefully. At first, he looked surprised. Then, almost too quickly, he masked it with a smile. "That's a great idea, Dad. You shouldn't have to deal with all this upkeep." Rachel, sitting next to him, looked less enthusiastic. Are you sure? She asked. Daniel cut in before I could answer. If you moved closer to us, it'd be perfect. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. We could even help you find a smaller place. Then he asked the question I had been waiting for. How much do you think you could get for it? There it was. I threw out a number more than I actually thought it was worth, just to see his reaction. His eyes lit up. Wow, that's a lot. Rachel looked down at her lap. She wasn't smiling. And just like that, I knew. I wanted to believe the best in my son. I wanted to believe he had come back because he loved me, not because he saw dollar signs. But in that moment, I saw it the way his mind was turning, already making plans. Later that night, when I passed by their room to get some water, I heard them talking, and I did something I had never done before. I listened. I wish I hadn't. He'll go for it, Daniel was saying. We just have to keep pushing. If he sells, we can finally pay off the house, and we'd still have enough left over for other stuff. Other stuff. Rachel's voice was quieter. But where would he live? Daniel barely hesitated. A retirement home. There are some nice ones near us. He'll have care. We'll visit. It's better this way. I felt my stomach drop. This was my son, the boy I had raised, the boy Margaret and I had given everything to. And here he was, plotting to take my home, my money, and put me away like some burden. I didn't hear the rest of the conversation. I couldn't. I walked away, my chest tight, my hands shaking. I had wanted so badly to believe in our second chance. But I was finally seeing the truth. Daniel didn't come back for me. He came back for my money. And now, I had to decide what to do about it. I barely slept that night. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I replayed the conversation I had had overheard again and again. I kept hoping I had misunderstood, that maybe Daniel wasn't really trying to push me out of my own home for a quick payday. But deep down, I knew what I had heard, and I knew what it meant. I wasn't his father to him. I was a problem to be solved, a bank account waiting to be emptied. By the time the sun came up, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to let him take advantage of me. That morning I acted like everything was normal. I made coffee, ate breakfast with them, even laughed at something Michael said. But inside, I was waiting for the right moment. I didn't have to wait long. Over lunch, Daniel brought it up again. So, Dad, have you thought any more about selling the house? He tried to sound casual, but I could hear the eagerness in his voice. I set my fork down and looked him right in the eye. I have, I said, and I've made my decision. Rachel glanced at me, looking nervous. Daniel, on the other hand, leaned forward, a smile already creeping onto his face. I'm not selling, I said firmly. Not now, not ever. His smile froze. Wait, what? I folded my hands on the table. I know what you've been doing, Daniel. I know you've been asking around about my finances. I know you've been pushing this idea because you want the money. Rachel inhaled sharply. Daniel's face darkened. Dad, that's not. I cut him off. I heard you, I said, my voice steady. I heard you last night, talking to Rachel, talking about how I should move into a retirement home, talking about how selling this house would help you pay off your debts. The color drained from Rachel's face. She looked down at her plate, silent. Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. He looked like a kid caught stealing from the cookie jar. Except this wasn't a cookie. This was my home, my life. You were eavesdropping? He finally said, his voice rising. I let out a bitter laugh. That's what you're mad about? Not that you were trying to manipulate me into selling my house, but that I caught you? His jaw tightened. That's not fair, Dad. You're twisting this. I shook my head. No, Daniel. What's not fair is you disappearing for years, ignoring your mother while she was dying, and then waltzing back in here, like the prodigal son, except you didn't come back for love. You came back for money. Rachel wiped at her eyes. She still hadn't said a word. Daniel slammed his fist on the table, making the dishes rattle. That's not true. I came back because I missed you. I leaned back, crossing my arms. Really? Then why did you barely call me before Mom died? Why did you never visit? Not even once. When she was sick? I paused, letting the silence stretch between us. Face it, Daniel. You didn't come back until you thought there was something in it for you. Daniel shot up from his chair, shoving it back. His face was red with anger. You know what, Dad? Fine. Believe whatever you want, but you're making a mistake. You can't handle this house on your own. I met his glare, my voice calm. That's my choice to make. Rachel finally spoke, her voice shaky. Daniel, maybe we should just go. He turned to her, his hands clenched. Seriously? After everything? You're taking his side? She didn't answer. I stood up, my knees aching, but I didn't let it show. You should go, I said. And don't come back. Michael and Lily, who had been playing in the living room, peeked in, their faces confused. Dad? Michael asked. What's going on? Rachel quickly stood and put a hand on his shoulder. Nothing, sweetie. We're just leaving. Daniel stared at me, his chest rising and falling quickly, like he wanted to say more. Maybe yell, maybe beg, but I had nothing left to give him. So instead, he shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and walked out. I watched from the doorway as they packed up the car. Michael and Lily waved at me from the back seat, still too young to understand what had just happened. I waved back, wondering if I'd ever see them again, and then they were gone. The house felt impossibly quiet after that. At first, I felt relief. Relief that I had stood my ground, that I hadn't let myself be taken advantage of. But as the hours passed, relief was replaced by something heavier. Grief. Not for Daniel, exactly. I had already lost him years ago. But for what could have been. For the version of him that Margaret and I had raised, the boy who used to laugh as he ran through these halls, who used to fall asleep on the couch after school. I sat in Margaret's old chair and let the weight of it sink in. This was it. I was alone. The next few weeks were hard. I kept expecting Daniel to call, to apologize, to say something, but he never did. I tried to move forward. I started volunteering at the local community center just to get out of the house. I reconnected with old friends, spent time with my sister. I even hired a housekeeper a few days a week to help with the upkeep. Since, if I was being honest, Daniel had been right about one thing. I wasn't as strong as I used to be, but I wasn't helpless. And I wasn't going to let this house become a tomb. One evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the trees, when my phone rang. For a second, my heart jumped. Maybe it's Daniel. But when I checked the screen, it was Rachel. I hesitated, then answered. Hello? She sighed on the other end. Hi, Mr. Callahan. She still called me that. Not Dad. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, she said softly, for everything. I didn't know Daniel was going to push you like that. I should have spoken up sooner. I swallowed hard. It's not your fault, Rachel. She hesitated. Then, quietly, she said, for what it's worth, I think he regrets it. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure if that changed anything. After a long pause, Rachel spoke again. The kids miss you. I closed my eyes. That part hurt the most. I cleared my throat. Tell them I miss them too. Another pause. Would you want to talk to them? Just for a minute? I almost said no. But then I thought about Michael and Lily innocent in all of this. They weren't the ones who had hurt me. Yeah, I said, my voice cracking. I'd like that. Rachel called for them, and within seconds, Michael's excited voice came through the phone. Grandpa! For the first time in weeks, I smiled. We talked for a while, and when we finally hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. I didn't know if I'd ever truly forgive Daniel, but maybe, just maybe, I hadn't lost everything after all.